Robert Redford's life, to the public eye, often shimmered with the golden glow of Hollywood success. But behind the curtains of red carpets and ovations lay a story of marriage, fatherhood, and heartbreak that tested him more deeply than any critic or studio could imagine. In 1958, just 22 years old and still unknown to the world, he married Lola van Wagenen, a woman of quiet intelligence and unwavering grace. Their beginning was stripped of luxury, borrowed furniture, shoestring budgets, and long nights of worry, yet bound by a fierce belief in one another. They were not building a Hollywood dream, but a fragile sanctuary against the world, a love they hoped could weather anything. The first test came cruelly swift. Their firstborn, Scott, survived only weeks. A nursery prepared with trembling joy fell silent, the air heavy with absence. "You never get over something like that," Redford would later admit. "You learn to live with it, but it never leaves you." His silence on the subject became its own language, the silence of empty mornings, of smiles that never quite reached the eyes, of a father who carried the unbearable knowledge that even the greatest triumphs of his future could never rewrite those few, vanished days. To the world, he would one day become the Sundance Kid. To himself, he was a young man marked forever by the ache of a life extinguished too soon. When their second son, Jamie, arrived, hope returned, but never without shadows. Born prematurely, Jamie's body carried fragility from the start. Hospitals became second homes, alarms and charts, a constant soundtrack. He endured multiple surgeries, 2 liver transplants, and years of fragile recoveries. Redford balanced sets and scripts with hospital corridors, yet every performance, every red carpet smile, was laced with the fear that the next call might shatter him. "It was like living with a storm always on the horizon," a friend recalled him saying. "You never knew when it would break." And in 2020, that storm finally struck. Jamie, after decades of resilience, succumbed to cancer of the bile ducts at 58. For Redford, now an old man himself, it was not only the loss of a son, it was the cruel echo of Scott, a nightmare replayed across decades, as though fate had circled back to reopen a wound that had never closed. Through it all, Lola was at his side. Their marriage spanned nearly 3 decades, from the anonymity of their youth to the blinding glare of fame. She raised their 4 children mostly away from Hollywood's chaos, building stability while his career carried him from set to set, from country to country. Together they endured the strain of success, his absences, the unending scrutiny, the weight of his public image. But time is merciless, and even strong love can wear thin under distance and pressure. In 1985, after 27 years, their marriage ended, not in scandal, but in quiet sadness. The recognition that 2 people who once fought side by side had grown apart. Redford never spoke with bitterness. On the contrary, he often called Lola the great love of his life, the woman who stood by him through the most vulnerable chapters, the partner who carried the weight with him when he was still untested. Gratitude survived where marriage did not. What makes this chapter of Redford's life so wrenching is not simply the tally of losses, but the contrast. While audiences saw him outwit villains as Johnny Hooker, stride across the screen as Sundance, or claim the Oscar for Ordinary People, the man behind those roles was returning to homes where silence echoed louder than applause. He lived 2 lives at once, one bathed in camera lights, another dimmed by hospital lamps. The world saw a legend. His family saw a father whispering encouragement beside a fragile child's bed, a husband trying to steady a marriage battered by distance and grief. And yet, from these private torments came a kind of strength no critic could measure. If his films felt authentic, it was because he had lived contradiction, joy and despair, victory and loss, light and shadow. If his performances carried grace, it was because he had endured moments where grace seemed impossible. He embodied resilience not as a slogan, but as a daily practice, choosing again and again to stand, to continue, to create, even when the ground beneath him seemed to give way. Robert Redford's marriage to Lola, their decades of struggle and devotion, the devastating loss of Scott, the lifelong battle and final farewell to Jamie, and the quiet parting of two people once convinced love could conquer all. This is not a footnote to his career, but the defining crucible of his humanity. The ovations will always belong to Hollywood, but the silences, the ones filled with grief, with endurance, with dignity, belong to Robert Redford, the man. And it is in those silences, as much as in the applause, that his legend truly resides. In the years that followed, Redford did not abandon the search for love. He was not the caricature of the carefree bachelor that tabloids wanted him to be. He was a man quietly testing whether his heart could trust again. There were chapters that glowed briefly, each one carrying its own truth. With Sonia Braga, the Brazilian actress whose luminous spirit matched his restless energy, there was warmth, admiration, and the short-lived joy of two artists finding each other between worlds. With Lena Olin, during the filming of Havana in 1990, there was chemistry so undeniable it seemed to suggest a future. Yet life is rarely as generous as the screen, and what began with promise softened into memory. There were others, too, companions like costume designer Kathy O'Rear, who moved quietly beside him in the wings of Hollywood, a presence steady and gentle during days when the machinery of stardom felt more like a burden than a gift. These connections were not failures. They were waypoints, small bridges across the distance between who he had been and who he was becoming. Each relationship held its own sincerity, its own spark, yet none settled into permanence. To the outside world, it might have seemed like enviable freedom, the legendary actor drifting through romances as effortlessly as he moved across a set. But the truth was lonelier, quieter. Each departure left behind a tender bruise, reopening in whispers the wound of a marriage that had once been his axis. It was not carelessness that made them brief, but the delicate tension inside him. A man yearning for the steadiness of love, yet afraid of its cost. A man who knew too well that every flame, however warm, carries the risk of ash. Jane Fonda, who worked with Redford over decades and cared for him deeply, offered perhaps the most piercing glimpse into this paradox. She described him as magnetic, yet elusive, capable of drawing others close, but always holding part of himself back, as if guarding a door that no one else could open. That distance was not indifference, it was survival. Redford had endured what most hearts could not bear: the death of an infant son, the long illness and eventual loss of another, the unraveling of a marriage that had defined his youth. To emerge from those storms was to learn a hard truth: that love could be both salvation and devastation. And so he carried into every relationship the ache of longing entwined with the fear of repetition, the hunger for intimacy shadowed by the dread of what its loss might bring. To speak of these years is not to catalogue lovers, nor to indulge in gossip, but to understand the more private narrative of a man wrestling with the echoes of absence. Redford was careful with affection, deliberate even when the world wanted to frame him as a perpetual heartthrob. What he sought was not conquest, but resonance, a voice that might steady the silence left behind, a companion who could share not the glamour of premieres, but the vulnerability of quiet nights. Sometimes he found it for a season, sometimes only for a fleeting moment. And each time it slipped away, he was left with both sorrow and insight, a deeper understanding of his own heart, and of the fragile bargain that every act of love entails. There is a particular ache that belongs to this part of his life, not the sharp pain of tragedy, but the lingering sorrow of almost. The ache of what might have been, but never quite was, of flames that warm briefly before fading to embers. For Redford, the years after divorce were marked by these embers, short but bright connections, moments when hope dared to flicker again, only to leave him once more with silence. They were not stories for scandal sheets, but lessons etched into the fabric of his humanity. They revealed a man still open to love, still vulnerable, still willing to risk the bruise for the chance of warmth. And so, behind the immaculate image of the Hollywood legend was a man gathering fragments, carrying them like sketches in a private notebook. If the first marriage was the bedrock of his youth, these later connections were brushstrokes, imperfect, incomplete, yet real. They may not have lasted, but they mattered. Because in them we glimpse Robert Redford not as an untouchable icon, but as a man of flesh and shadow, scarred, cautious, yet unwilling to let loss have the final word. He remained, even in solitude, a believer in love, knowing full well it could wound, but refusing to surrender the hope that it could also heal. To speak of Robert Redford's life is to speak not only of his roles and achievements, but also of the people who stood beside him, whose presence became part of his own story. Among them, few left marks as deep as Natalie Wood and Paul Newman, two companions on different stretches of his journey, both of whom shaped his life in ways only true friends can, and whose departures carved absences that no triumph could ever fill. Natalie Wood entered Redford's orbit in the early 1960s, when both were still carving out their place in Hollywood. They worked together in Inside Daisy Clover, 1965, and again in This Property is Condemned, 1966. And what began as professional collaboration quickly grew into mutual trust. Redford admired the way she carried a delicate mix of vulnerability and steel, luminous on screen, yet still marked by the insecurities of someone who had grown up too quickly under the gaze of the spotlight. Later, he would recall her kindness during those uncertain years, the way she encouraged him as he stumbled through the transition from stage to screen, when the glamour of film sets was matched only by the quiet terror of self-doubt. Their connection was not romantic, but sibling-like. Two ambitious young actors clinging to one another's presence in an industry that judged without mercy. Then came 1981. Redford was 45, at the summit of his career, when the news reached him. Natalie was gone, just 43. Her life ended suddenly in circumstances that left more questions than answers. To the world, it was a headline. To him, it was the silence of a voice he had once counted on, the empty space where a friend's laughter used to live. He rarely spoke of her loss, but those who knew him sensed how it haunted him. It was a cruel reminder that the golden age they had shared was fragile, that no matter how bright the light of fame, it could be extinguished without warning. In memory, Natalie remained forever luminous, forever young, but also forever absent. If Natalie's passing was a sudden blow in midlife, Paul Newman's death, nearly 3 decades later, was a different kind of wound. Slower, deeper, and tethered to decades of companionship. From the day they joined forces in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, their chemistry electrified audiences, but off-screen, it ignited something rarer: brotherhood, Newman, already seasoned, met Redford's wit and daring with equal mischief. They raced cars, played practical jokes, swapped confidences over beers, and shared the kind of laughter that could pierce through even the heaviest of days. For Redford, Newman was not simply a colleague. He was an anchor, the one person who understood the peculiar loneliness of fame without explanation. Their friendship carried across nearly 40 years, deepened by another masterpiece together, The Sting, 1973, and countless private moments no camera ever caught. But in the final act, Newman's boundless energy yielded to illness. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and the man once defined by vitality faced a decline that was painful to witness. Redford visited when he could, and though Newman's humor flickered to the very end, Redford knew he was watching not just a friend, but a piece of his own past slip away. When Newman died in 2008 at 83, Redford, then 72, summed it up in words stripped bare. "There's a hole in my life now." It was not a statement for the press. It was the confession of a man who had lost the brother he had chosen. To lose Natalie in the middle years and Newman in the later years was to experience grief in two shades. One, the shock of a life cut cruelly short. The other, the long ache of watching time itself claim what illness had already begun to erode. Both losses reminded Redford that even legends are mortal, that no measure of fame or success can guard the heart against absence. Yet in the silence they left behind, he carried gratitude. Gratitude for Natalie's encouragement when he was still unsteady. Gratitude for Newman's laughter that carried him through the storms. And so, behind the myth of the Sundance Kid stands a man who has learned to linger in theaters of memory, applauding friends who no longer take the stage. The world may celebrate his films, but Redford himself will always remember the faces beside him, the light they brought into his life, and the quiet, unfillable spaces left when the curtain fell too soon. Robert Redford's story, so long cast in the hard light of triumph and shadowed by grief, softened into something altogether different in the late 1990s. That was when he met Sibylle Zaggers, a German-born artist whose world was not studios and spotlights, but brushstrokes, installations, and the quiet insistence of nature. Where Hollywood had demanded noise, Sibylle carried silence. Where the past had left scars, she offered space. To encounter her was, for Redford, like watching rain fall across a desert. Sudden, gentle, impossible to ignore. The air changed. The ground, long dry, began to breathe again. Their companionship grew slowly, as all enduring things do. It was not the fever of youth, but the steady rhythm of two souls who had known fragility and no longer needed to hurry. She did not ask him to be Robert Redford the star, nor Robert Redford the legend. With her, he could simply be a man, still marked by storms, but no longer carried by them. By the time they married in 2009, when he was 73, Redford himself said it was like a new life. The words were plain, but in their simplicity lay decades of searching, of waiting for the kind of peace that had eluded him for so long. Together, they found not only love, but a shared calling. From their home in Santa Fe, where desert skies stretch wide and sudden rains transform the land, they created The Way of the Rain. It was part performance, part prayer. Sibylle painting with light and form, Redford giving voice to stories of Earth's beauty and its peril. To audiences, it was art. To them, it was devotion, an offering to the planet and to each other. In those evenings, as music rose and images of water swept across a stage, Redford was no longer acting a role. He was speaking from his core, alongside the woman who had become both partner and sanctuary. This late chapter carries a gentleness absent from the earlier ones. It is not the young husband counting dollars in 1958, not the grieving father beside hospital beds, not the friend stunned by empty chairs where laughter once sat.